The metal chair felt cold against Commander Zexathara's blue skin. Her forearms rested on the table, but they would not stop shaking. The scars on her shell-like body hurt more today than they had in weeks. The doctors said it was normal for survivors. They said the pain would fade with time. They were wrong about many things. The room was white and clean. Too clean. It reminded her of human medical bays, and that made her stomach twist. 12 beings sat across from her, each from a different world. They represented the Galactic Council, the most powerful group in known space. Today they wanted answers. They wanted to know how the war ended so quickly. They wanted to know about the humans. Zexathara wished she could forget what she had seen. "Commander," said Council Leader Varthan. His voice was soft like all his people. The Zenthari were known for their calm nature. "We know this is difficult, but we must understand what happened during the Hegemony War. The entire galaxy depends on it." She looked at him with her large compound eyes. Each eye could see in different directions, but now they all focused on one thing: fear. Her own fear, reflected in the faces around the table. "You want to know about humans," she said. Her voice came out as a whisper. "You think they saved us? You think they are heroes, are they not?" asked another council member. This one was Thorkin, from the warrior planet Krex. His people had fought in 1,000 wars. He had scars of his own, but not like hers. His scars came from honorable battle. Hers came from something else entirely. Zexathara laughed, but there was no joy in it. "Heroes, yes, perhaps they are heroes. But do you know what that means? Do you really know what humans call heroic?" The council members looked at each other. Some shifted in their seats. They had all heard stories, but stories were different from truth. Stories made things sound clean and simple. The truth was neither. "Tell us what you saw," Varthan said gently. "Start from the beginning, the beginning." Zexathara closed her eyes and tried to remember when the universe still made sense. Before she learned that everything they thought they knew about war was wrong. Before she learned that some species did not fight to win, but to make sure their enemies could never sleep peacefully again. The war had been going badly for 2 years, she began. The hegemony was winning on every front. The Vorth Empire and the Scrix Collective had joined forces. Nothing could stop them. They had better ships, better weapons, better numbers. She paused and touched one of her scars. This one ran from her shoulder to her elbow. A human had given her this scar, but not in the way anyone might think. Our fleets were breaking apart. Entire systems were falling every month. The outer colonies were begging for help, but we had nothing left to give them. Then the humans arrived. "How many ships did they bring?" asked Thorkin. Warriors always wanted to know about numbers and weapons. 57 ships, Zexathara said. Old ships. Strange ships. They looked like they were built in someone's backyard using spare parts. We thought they were refugees at first. Maybe traders who had lost their way. She remembered that first day clearly. The human ships had appeared at the edge of the Kepler system without warning. No one had seen them coming. Their technology was different, primitive in some ways. But there was something about those ships that made her nervous. They moved wrong. They moved like living things instead of machines. Admiral Kresh was in command of our forces, she continued. He ordered me to make contact with the human ships. We thought they might be running from the hegemony. We thought they needed protection. What happened when you contacted them? Zexathara smiled again, that same joyless expression. They asked if we needed help. Can you believe that? 57 old ships asking if they could help us fight an empire that had crushed 100 worlds. The memory made her feel sick. She had laughed at them then. Everyone had laughed. They thought it was cute, like children offering to help adults move heavy furniture. They had no idea what they were dealing with. Admiral Kresh told them to stay back and watch. He said we would handle the hegemony forces ourselves. The humans just said okay, and moved their ships to the rear of our formation. We thought they would run when the fighting started. But they didn't run, Varthan said. It wasn't a question. No, they didn't run. When the hegemony fleet arrived, they didn't run. When our ships started exploding around them, they didn't run. When the Vorth dreadnoughts began cutting through our lines like they were made of paper, the humans moved forward. Zexathara stood up and walked to the window. Outside, she could see the capital city of Zenthar Prime. Peaceful streets, clean buildings, happy families walking together. A normal world where normal people lived normal lives. She envied them. The first thing that made me afraid was how they moved, she said, still looking out the window. Every species in the galaxy has patterns. The Vorth attack in straight lines because they value honor. The Skrik swarm because they think as one mind. The Zenthari use careful formations because they plan everything. And humans? Humans moved like hunters, like predators who had been chasing the same prey for so long that they knew exactly how it would try to escape. Their ships spread out in ways that made no tactical sense until suddenly they did. They didn't follow any doctrine we recognized. She turned back to face the council. Some of them were taking notes. Others just stared at her with growing concern. The second thing that made me afraid was their communications. We could listen to their radio channels. Every other species talks about tactics during battle. Status reports, target assignments, request for backup. Professional soldier talk. What did the humans talk about? Home, she said quietly. They talked about their families, their friends, their pets. One pilot spent 10 minutes describing his daughter's birthday party while he was flying straight into a Vorth battlecruiser. Another one was reading poetry, in the middle of a space battle. The council members looked confused. Thorkin spoke first. That sounds like poor discipline. That's what we thought too. We thought they were amateurs who would get themselves killed quickly. But then something strange happened. The more they talked about home, the more dangerous they became. It was like each memory made them stronger instead of weaker. Zexithara sat back down. Her hands were shaking worse now, but she continued. The council needed to hear this. They needed to understand what they had invited into their galaxy. By the end of the first battle, we had lost 40% of our fleet. The hegemony had lost only 15% of theirs. It should have been a disaster. But when I looked at the human ships, I realized something terrible. What? They weren't trying to win the battle. They were studying the enemy, learning how they fought, how they moved, how they thought. They were treating our defeat as a classroom. The room was quiet now. Even the note-takers had stopped writing. That night, the human commander came to our ship, small woman with gray hair and calm eyes. She asked Admiral Kresh if she could speak privately with our senior officers. She wanted to share some ideas about fighting the hegemony. Zexithara looked around the table at the 12 council members. Soon they would understand. Soon they would realize what kind of allies they had gained. And like her, they would never sleep peacefully again. The human commander's name was Sarah Chen. She looked ordinary, the kind of person you might pass on the street without noticing. But when she spoke, everyone in the room listened. There was something in her voice that made Zexithara's survival instincts wake up and pay attention. Your tactics are good, Chen had said to Admiral Kresh. Clean, efficient, professional. You follow the rules of war perfectly. Admiral Kresh had been pleased by the compliment. He was proud of his training, his discipline, his honor. Thank you, Commander. We study warfare as both art and science. That's your problem, Chen replied. The silence in the room had been complete. No one spoke to an admiral that way, especially not someone from a species that had just lost their first battle. But Chen continued as if she hadn't just insulted the most respected military leader in the sector. You fight like this is a game with rules. Like there's a referee who will blow a whistle if someone cheats. The hegemony doesn't play games. They play to win, and they don't care how they do it. Zexithara remembered feeling angry then. How dare this human question their methods? The Galactic Naval Academy had spent centuries perfecting these tactics. Every major victory in known history had been won using these principles. Our methods have been tested across 1,000 campaigns, Admiral Kresh had said stiffly. They are proven effective. Against enemies who follow the same rules, Chen agreed. But what happens when you face an enemy who doesn't care about your rules? What happens when they target your medical ships? Your supply convoys? Your families? The questions had made everyone uncomfortable. Such things were forbidden by the Galactic War protocols. No civilized species would break such fundamental laws. The hegemony would never, Kresh began. They already have, Chen interrupted. 3 days ago, they destroyed a hospital ship in the Rigel system. Yesterday, they bombed civilian shelters on Andros Colony. Tomorrow, they'll do something worse. Zexithara told the council how Chen had pulled out a datapad and shown them intelligence reports, images of destroyed medical facilities, recordings of distress calls from civilian populations, evidence of war crimes that no one wanted to believe. How did you get this information? Kresh had asked. We've been watching the hegemony for 6 months, Chen said simply, learning their patterns, understanding their mindset. They're not interested in honorable victory. They want total domination, and they'll use any method to get it. So what do you suggest? Zexthara had asked. She was only a commander then, junior to most of the officers in the room. But something about the human woman made her want to hear more. Chen had smiled then. It wasn't a pleasant expression. We stop fighting their war and start fighting our own. What followed was the strangest military briefing Zexthara had ever attended. Chen began by asking questions that no one had thought to ask. How long could hegemony ships operate without resupply? What happened to their formations when their command ships were destroyed? How did they react when faced with unexpected tactics? You've been trying to beat them at their own game, Chen explained. But they've had centuries to perfect their game. We need to change the rules. She had outlined a plan that seemed insane at first. Instead of meeting the hegemony in direct battle, they would attack their supply lines. Instead of protecting every colony equally, they would evacuate some and turn others into traps. Instead of following predictable patrol routes, they would disappear for weeks at a time, then strike without warning. This sounds like... Admiral Kresh struggled for the word. Like terrorism. It sounds like survival, Chen replied. And it sounds like victory. Zexthara paused in her testimony to drink some water. Her throat was dry and her hands were still shaking. The council members waited patiently, but she could see the questions in their eyes. They wanted to know how a species barely capable of interstellar travel had convinced their greatest military minds to abandon everything they believed about warfare. The first operation was supposed to be simple, she continued. A raid on a hegemony supply depot in an empty system. We were supposed to destroy their fuel and ammunition, then retreat before their main fleet could respond. What went wrong? Asked Thorkin. Nothing went wrong. That was the problem. The humans had planned for everything to go right and more. The raid had been a complete success. They destroyed the depot, captured several hegemony officers for interrogation, and escaped without losing a single ship. But during the operation, Zexthara had watched the humans work, and what she saw had changed her understanding of what her new allies were capable of. They moved through that facility like they had built it themselves, she told the council. Every corridor, every security system, every weak point in the structure. They knew it all. But that wasn't the strange part. What was? The strange part was how they treated the hegemony soldiers they captured. Most species take prisoners for information or prisoner exchanges. The humans took them for something else. Zexthara remembered watching Chen interrogate a Vorth captain. The conversation had been polite, almost friendly. Chen had offered the prisoner food, medical care, even entertainment. She had asked about his family, his homeworld, his military service. To anyone watching, it would have seemed like a casual conversation between professionals. But Zexthara had access to the translation software, and she could hear what was really happening. Every question, every comment, every moment of apparent kindness was designed to reveal something about Vorth psychology, their cultural values, their fears and motivations. Chen wasn't just gathering tactical intelligence, she was learning how her enemies thought. By the time we released the prisoners, Zexthara continued, the humans knew more about Vorth military doctrine than some Vorth officers did. They had identified weaknesses in their training, gaps in their equipment, flaws in their command structure that could be exploited. Impressive intelligence work, Varthan commented. It wasn't intelligence work, Zexthara said. It was something else, something deeper. The humans weren't just learning how to fight the Vorth, they were learning how to break them. The second operation had been more ambitious. A direct attack on a hegemony forward base, designed to test their new tactics. Again, the plan had worked perfectly. But this time Zexthara had been assigned to work directly with a human boarding party. I thought I understood combat, she told the council. I had been in dozens of battles, earned commendations for bravery, led successful missions against pirates and rebels. But watching humans fight was like watching a completely different species. She closed her eyes and tried to find words for what she had witnessed. How could she explain the way human soldiers moved through a battle zone? Other species fought with careful precision, maintaining formation, following doctrine, minimizing risk. Humans fought like controlled chaos, each soldier acting independently while somehow maintaining perfect coordination with their team. They used everything as a weapon, she said finally. Broken pipes became spears. Electrical cables became whips. Emergency oxygen canisters became bombs. They turned the enemy's own ship against them. using the artificial gravity to pin Vorth soldiers to the ceiling, venting atmosphere to create confusion, even reprogramming the intercom system to broadcast disturbing sounds that disrupted Scrix Hive communication. Resourceful, Thorkin noted approvingly. It was more than resourceful, Zexthera insisted. It was like they had been preparing for this exact battle their entire lives. Like every human child was taught to see the world as a collection of potential weapons and tactical advantages. The operation had ended with complete victory. The hegemony base was destroyed, its garrison captured or killed, and valuable intelligence recovered. But for Zexthera, the real revelation came during the evacuation. One of the human soldiers had been badly wounded during the fighting. Plasma burns covered half his body and he was clearly dying. Any other species would have sedated him, made him comfortable, and prepared for his death. Instead, his teammates gathered around him and asked for his final tactical assessment. He spent his last 10 minutes of life analyzing our performance, Zexthera whispered, pointing out mistakes we had made, suggesting improvements for next time, sharing observations about enemy weaknesses he had noticed. He died giving us advice on how to kill more efficiently. The council chamber was silent now. Zexthera could see the growing unease in their faces. They were beginning to understand that this wasn't a story about noble allies who had saved the galaxy. This was something else entirely. That's when I realized, she said, that humans don't just fight wars. They live war. They breathe it, study it, perfect it even in death. And that was only the beginning. 3 weeks after the base raid, Admiral Kresh called an emergency meeting. Intelligence reports were coming in from across the sector, and none of them made sense. Hegemony forces were behaving strangely, making tactical errors that veteran commanders would never make. Supply lines were being disrupted by attacks that seemed to come from nowhere. Most disturbing of all, several hegemony commanders had requested immediate transfer away from human-controlled sectors. They're afraid, Chen had said when asked to explain. Fear makes people stupid. Zexthera told the council how Chen had presented her analysis of hegemony psychology. The Vorth Empire valued honor above all else. They believed in facing enemies directly, winning through superior skill and courage. The Scrix collective thought as a unified mind, making decisions through consensus and shared knowledge. Both species had fought wars for thousands of years, but always against enemies who shared similar values. Humans don't share those values, Chen had explained. We don't care about honor when survival is at stake. We don't make decisions through consensus when speed matters more than agreement. And we've learned something that most species never learn. What's that? Admiral Kresh had asked. How to think like our enemies while still thinking like ourselves. The next phase of operations proved this point in ways that still made Zexthera's scales itch with discomfort. Chen had divided the human fleet into small groups, each one assigned to study a different aspect of hegemony behavior. Some focused on Vorth combat doctrines, others on Scrix communication patterns. But the largest group had been given the strangest assignment of all. They were told to think like hegemony commanders, Zexthera told the council, to plan attacks against us, using everything they had learned about our weaknesses. The idea had horrified the Allied officers, who asked their own troops to plan their destruction, but Chen had insisted it was necessary. If they wanted to predict hegemony moves, they needed to understand how hegemony minds worked, and the best way to understand an enemy was to become one, at least temporarily. The results had been devastating. Within a week, the human analysis teams had identified 17 different ways the hegemony could cripple the Allied fleet. They found weaknesses in communication protocols, gaps in patrol coverage, and tactical blind spots that had existed for decades without anyone noticing. It was like looking in a mirror and seeing all your flaws at once, Zexthera said. Every assumption we had made about our own defenses was wrong. Every doctrine we trusted had fatal weaknesses. The humans found them all. But the real horror came when Chen presented the final report. She hadn't just identified Allied weaknesses. She had developed detailed plans for exploiting them. Battle scenarios that would destroy the fleet in hours. Psychological warfare techniques that would break Allied morale without firing a shot. Strategic approaches that would turn the galaxy's greatest military powers against each other. She gave us a complete guide to our own destruction, Zexthera whispered. And then she smiled and said, "Now we know what the hegemony will try next." Council Leader Varthan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Did her predictions prove accurate? Every single one. The hegemony tried 3 major offensives over the next month. Each time we were ready. Not because we were stronger or smarter, but because we had learned to think like them. We knew what they would do before they knew it themselves. The psychological impact on hegemony forces had been immediate and severe. Commanders who had never lost a battle found themselves outmaneuvered by tactics they couldn't understand. Elite units that had conquered dozens of worlds were defeated by enemies who seemed to know their every move. Worse, the defeats weren't clean or honorable. They were confusing, demoralizing, designed to leave survivors questioning everything they believed about warfare. The humans called it breaking their decision-making process, Zexithera explained. They weren't just trying to win battles. They were trying to make the enemy afraid to make any decisions at all. The campaign that followed still gave Zexithera nightmares. Human forces began appearing in impossible places, striking targets that should have been beyond their reach, then vanishing before reinforcements could arrive. They attacked when logic said they should retreat, retreated when victory seemed certain, and followed no pattern that hegemony analysts could predict. The worst part was that they were always recording everything, Zexithera said. Every battle, every conversation with prisoners, every tactical decision made by enemy commanders. They were building a database of how different species think under pressure. For what purpose? So they would never have to learn the same lessons twice. Every defeat taught them something new about their enemies. Every victory showed them what worked and what didn't. They were treating the entire war as a learning experience. Zexithera described the Battle of Proxima Station, where human tactical analysis reached its most terrifying extreme. The station was a key hegemony stronghold, defended by their best troops and most advanced weapons. Any conventional assault would have been suicide, so the humans didn't assault it. Instead, they surrounded the station and began broadcasting on all frequencies. Not threats or surrender demands, but something much worse. They broadcast detailed psychological profiles of every hegemony commander in the system. Personal information about their families, their fears, their military records, their secret shames. Information that should have been impossible to obtain. How did they get such detailed intelligence? Asked Thorkin. They didn't, Zexithera said. They created it. Using everything they had learned about Vorth and Skrik psychology, they built fake profiles designed to sound real. But that wasn't the clever part. What was? The profiles were wrong. Deliberately, obviously wrong. But they contained just enough accurate details to make enemy commanders wonder how much else the humans might know. Real intelligence mixed with psychological warfare, designed to make every hegemony officer paranoid about what secrets might be revealed next. The broadcasts had continued for 6 days. During that time, hegemony forces on the station began turning on each other. Commanders accused their subordinates of leaking information. Soldiers reported their officers for suspicious behavior. The unified defense of the station collapsed into chaos as everyone began suspecting everyone else of being a human spy. On the 7th day, the humans attacked, but not with ships and soldiers. They sent a single transport carrying medical supplies, claiming they wanted to help treat the wounded from the civil disturbances on the station. The hegemony forces, exhausted and demoralized, actually allowed them to dock. The medical team contained no weapons, Zexithera told the council. No explosives, no toxins, no sabotage equipment. Just doctors and nurses providing genuine medical care to wounded soldiers. Then how did they capture the station? They didn't need to capture it. By the time they left, half the hegemony forces wanted to surrender, and the other half wanted to desert. The humans had broken their will to fight without firing a single shot. The station fell to a follow-up assault 3 hours later, defended by soldiers who had forgotten how to trust each other. The pattern had repeated itself across the sector. Human forces would study their enemies, identify their psychological weaknesses, then exploit those weaknesses in ways that left survivors broken and confused. It wasn't just military defeat. It was something deeper, more permanent, a destruction of confidence that made former soldiers afraid to pick up weapons again. They turned warfare into a science, Zexithera said. Not the science of destruction, but the science of the mind. They learned to break spirits as efficiently as they broke ships. But the most disturbing revelation was yet to come. During a planning session for the final offensive against hegemony space, Admiral Kresh had asked Chen about human military history. How long had they been developing these psychological warfare techniques? What conflicts had taught them such sophisticated methods? Chen's answer had changed everything. We developed these techniques fighting ourselves, she had said calmly. Humans have been at war with other humans for our entire recorded history. Every method we've used against the hegemony, we learned by using it against our own species first. The silence in the briefing room had been absolute. The idea that a species could survive constant warfare with itself was unthinkable. But Chen had continued describing millennia of human conflict, each war teaching new lessons about psychology, strategy, and the limits of what thinking beings could endure. We know how to break enemy morale because we've spent thousands of years learning how to break our own, she had explained. We understand psychological warfare because we've been practicing it on ourselves since we invented language. Every technique that terrifies the hegemony is something we've already survived. Zexathera looked around the council chamber at the 12 species representatives, each one struggling to comprehend what they were hearing. That's when I realized we hadn't gained powerful allies, she said quietly. We had invited something into our galaxy that had learned to fight by destroying itself over and over again, until it became immune to its own weapons, and now that species was offering to use those weapons for us. The final offensive against hegemony space began with something no one expected. Surrender, Zexathera told the council how Admiral Kresh had received a message from the human command ship, informing him that 3 human vessels were surrendering to hegemony forces in the outer system. The ships had suffered engine failures and were requesting rescue from the nearest Vorth patrol. We thought it was a mistake, Zexathera said. Some kind of communication error. Humans didn't surrender. We had watched them fight to the death in dozens of battles rather than give up. But Chen had confirmed the order personally. 3 ships carrying nearly 300 human soldiers were surrendering voluntarily to the enemy. When Admiral Kresh demanded an explanation, Chen had simply said they were testing a theory. What theory? Thorkin asked. Whether the hegemony would treat human prisoners according to galactic war protocols, or if they would reveal their true nature when they thought they were safe. The answer came within hours. The hegemony forces didn't just accept the surrender, they broadcast it across their entire network, celebrating the first human defeat of the war. They paraded the prisoners before cameras, forcing them to record statements denouncing their own military and praising hegemony superiority. But the humans in the videos looked wrong. They spoke the required words, but their eyes held something that made Zexathera's skin crawl. They looked like people who were waiting for something. People who knew a secret that their captors didn't. The hegemony commanders made a mistake, Zexathera continued. They assumed that breaking human morale would be like breaking any other species' morale. They used standard interrogation techniques, standard psychological pressure, standard methods of humiliation. Did it work? It worked perfectly. Too perfectly. The humans broke exactly when they were supposed to break, said exactly what they were supposed to say, showed exactly the right amount of fear and desperation. They gave their captors what they wanted so efficiently that no one questioned whether it was real. What followed was the most sophisticated intelligence operation Zexathera had ever witnessed. The captured humans began providing information about Allied fleet movements, tactical plans, and strategic weaknesses. All of it was accurate. All of it was verifiable. All of it was exactly what the hegemony wanted to hear, and all of it was designed to lead them into the perfect trap. The humans weren't just pretending to be broken, Zexathera explained. They were genuinely suffering. The torture was real, the pain was real, the humiliation was real, but somehow they had trained themselves to suffer productively, to turn their own agony into a weapon. The information provided by the prisoners led the hegemony to launch their largest offensive of the war. Every available ship, every veteran commander, every elite unit was committed to a massive assault on what appeared to be a critically undermanned Allied stronghold. Intelligence suggested that a successful attack would shatter Allied resistance and end the war. The intelligence was correct. A successful attack would have ended the war. But success required the hegemony forces to arrive at a specific location, at a specific time, in a specific formation. Everything the captured humans had told them was designed to ensure they would do exactly that. The trap wasn't ships or weapons, Zexathera said. The trap was information. The humans had spent months learning how hegemony commanders think, how they make decisions, how they react to different types of intelligence. Then they crafted a perfect lie. one that would make their enemies choose to do exactly what the humans wanted them to do. When the hegemony fleet arrived at the coordinates provided by their prisoners, they found what appeared to be a standard Allied defensive formation, outnumbered 3-1, deployed in predictable patterns following conventional tactics. Everything suggested an easy victory. The first sign that something was wrong came when the Allied ships didn't retreat. Every tactical manual said they should fall back when faced with superior numbers. Instead, they advanced. The second sign was the communications. Instead of the disciplined military chatter expected during a desperate defensive action, human voices filled the airwaves with something else entirely. Stories, memories, conversations about things that had nothing to do with the battle. They talked about Earth, Zexthara whispered, about blue skies and green grass and animals that no longer existed, about children they would never see again and promises they had made to people who were already dead. The council members looked confused.
Why would they waste communication bandwidth on such things?
Because they weren't talking to each other, Zexthara said. They were talking to us, to me, to every Allied soldier in the fleet. They wanted us to understand something important before the battle ended. What? That they were already dead. All of them. Every human in that fleet had volunteered for a mission they knew they wouldn't survive. They weren't fighting to win. They were fighting to make sure we would remember what winning cost. The battle that followed defied every principle of space combat. Human ships moved in patterns that seemed suicidal, making attacks that should have been impossible, sacrificing themselves in ways that accomplished nothing tactical. The hegemony forces began to relax, assuming their enemies had finally broken under pressure. Then the real attack began. The human fleet wasn't the trap, Zexthara told the council. The human fleet was the bait. While the hegemony was focused on destroying them, the real human force was moving into position. Hidden in asteroid fields, disguised as space debris, concealed behind stellar phenomena, the main human battle group had been waiting, not for the perfect tactical moment but for the perfect psychological one. The moment when hegemony commanders were distracted by easy victory and convinced of human weakness. The assault lasted 6 hours. When it ended, the largest hegemony fleet in history had been reduced to scattered survivors and wreckage. But the humans had paid a price that horrified their allies. Of the 800 ships that participated in the battle, fewer than 50 survived. Nearly 30,000 human soldiers died in a single engagement. Any other species would have called it a disaster, Zexthara said. The casualty rate was beyond acceptable losses, beyond military necessity, beyond anything that could be justified by strategic gain. But the humans called it a victory, Varthan said quietly. No, they called it a lesson, a demonstration for the rest of the galaxy about what humans were willing to sacrifice to protect their allies. They wanted everyone to understand that crossing humanity meant facing people who could calculate the exact price of victory and pay it without hesitation. The aftermath of the battle had been even more disturbing than the battle itself. Human survivors showed no signs of trauma, grief, or regret. They filed tactical reports, analyzed enemy performance, and began planning the next operation as if nothing unusual had happened. When Allied officers expressed concern about the massive losses, human commanders seemed genuinely confused by the concern. They asked us what we expected, Zexthara said. They pointed out that the mission objectives had been achieved, the enemy was broken, and Allied space was secure. From their perspective, the operation had been a complete success. The fact that most of them had died was just a detail in the after-action report. But the most chilling moment came during the prisoner exchange. The 300 humans who had surrendered at the beginning of the offensive were returned as part of the ceasefire negotiations. They had been tortured, starved, and subjected to psychological warfare for weeks. They should have been broken, traumatized shells of their former selves. Instead, they reported for duty immediately upon return. They had spent their time in captivity gathering intelligence, Zexthara explained, learning about hegemony prison procedures, guard rotations, interrogation techniques, and psychological profiles of their captors. They had detailed maps of every hegemony detention facility in the sector, complete tactical assessments of guard capabilities, and recommendations for how to break other prisoners out of similar situations. They turned their own torture into a reconnaissance mission, Thorkin said with something like awe in his voice. More than that, They had identified 17 hegemony soldiers who might be willing to defect, 12 facility weaknesses that could be exploited in future operations, and 6 different methods for escaping from hegemony custody. They had accomplished more intelligence gathering as prisoners than some Spec Ops teams manage in months of covert operations. The returned prisoners showed no signs of trauma. No nightmares, no flashbacks, no psychological damage that anyone could detect. When asked how they had endured such treatment, they explained that they had been trained for it. Trained to suffer, to endure, to maintain their mission focus even under the worst possible conditions. That's when I realized something that still keeps me awake at night, Zexathera said. Humans don't just train their soldiers to fight. They train them to be destroyed. They prepare every warrior for capture, torture, death, and worse. They teach them to remain functional even when everything that makes life worth living has been taken away. The council chamber was silent. Zexathera could see the growing horror in their faces as they began to understand what kind of allies they had gained. The peace negotiations took place on a neutral station in empty space. Representatives from every major galactic power attended, along with observers from dozens of smaller worlds. Everyone wanted to see how the galaxy would change now that the hegemony war was over. Zexathera had been part of the Allied delegation. She watched as former enemies sat across from each other, trying to find words for what had happened. The Vorth delegation looked exhausted, beaten down in ways that had nothing to do with military defeat. The Scrix representatives spoke in whispers, their usual hive-mind confidence replaced by something like fear. But it was the human delegation that drew everyone's attention. There were only 3 of them, Zexathera told the council. Commander Chen, an elderly man who introduced himself as a diplomat, and a young woman who never spoke but took notes on everything. They sat quietly while everyone else argued about territory reparations and security guarantees. The negotiations had dragged on for days. Traditional issues of war and peace seemed simple, compared to the new questions raised by human involvement. How do you write treaties with a species that doesn't think like anyone else? How do you establish rules of engagement with allies who have proven that all previous rules are meaningless? The turning point came when the Vorth ambassador accused humans of war crimes, Zexathera said. He listed every unconventional tactic they had used, every psychological warfare technique, every method that violated traditional concepts of honorable combat. Chen had listened to the accusations without interruption. When the Vorth ambassador finished, she had asked a single question. Which specific galactic law did we break? The silence that followed had been uncomfortable. Everyone knew that humans had fought in ways that felt wrong, that challenged fundamental assumptions about how civilized beings should behave. But when forced to cite actual violations of established law, the accusers found they had nothing. The humans had been careful, Zexathera explained. Every operation they conducted was technically legal under galactic war protocols. Psychological warfare wasn't forbidden. Using captured intelligence to plan attacks wasn't against the rules. Even their most disturbing tactics fell within the bounds of established law. But not within the bounds of custom and tradition, Varthan observed. Exactly. And that's when I realized what the humans had really done. They hadn't broken the law. They had exposed how inadequate our laws were. They had shown us that everything we thought we understood about civilized warfare was based on assumptions that no longer applied. The real revelation came when the Scrix delegate asked Chen to explain human military philosophy. How did their species approach the concept of acceptable losses? What principles guided their tactical decisions? How did they maintain morale under such extreme conditions? Chen's answer had changed everything. We don't have a military philosophy, she had said. We have a survival philosophy. Everything else grows from that. She had explained how human military doctrine was based on a simple premise. The universe was hostile, dangerous, and full of things that wanted to destroy humanity. Everything humans did, every tactic they developed, every psychological technique they mastered, was designed with one goal in mind: survival. Not just individual survival, but species survival. Other races fight wars to gain something, Chen had told the delegation. Territory, resources, political advantage. Humans fight wars to continue existing. When survival is at stake, everything else becomes secondary. The implications had been staggering. If humans approached every conflict as a fight for species survival, then there were no limits to what they might do. No weapon they wouldn't use, no sacrifice they wouldn't make, no method they wouldn't consider. The scariest part, Zexithera said, was that they meant it. This wasn't political rhetoric or military posturing. Commander Chen was explaining their genuine worldview. From the human perspective, every war is potentially the last war. Every enemy is potentially an extinction-level threat. Every battle is potentially the one that determines whether their species continues to exist. The peace treaty that emerged from those negotiations was unlike anything in galactic history. Traditional concepts of territorial sovereignty and resource rights were maintained, but new clauses had been added. Provisions for psychological warfare, guidelines for unconventional tactics, and most importantly, a new category of conflict classification. Total war, Zexithera said, a classification that applies when the survival of an entire species is threatened. Under total war provisions, normal rules of engagement are suspended. Any method becomes acceptable if it's necessary for species survival. The other delegates had agreed to these provisions because they seemed theoretical. What species would be insane enough to threaten the complete extinction of another race? What conflict could possibly justify such extreme measures? They had missed the point entirely. Humans didn't see total war as an exception to normal rules. They saw it as the fundamental reality underlying all conflict. From their perspective, every war was a total war because any defeat could lead to consequences that threatened species survival. The treaty was signed. The war ended and everyone went home thinking peace had been restored. Zexithera continued. But the real changes were just beginning. Within months, human military advisors were being requested by governments across the galaxy. Not for their technology or their ships, but for their tactical expertise. Species that had never lost a war wanted to learn human methods. Civilizations that prided themselves on honorable combat wanted to understand psychological warfare. The humans were happy to teach. They established training centers, published tactical manuals, and shared their knowledge freely. But everyone who learned from them came away changed in fundamental ways. I attended one of their tactical seminars, Zexithera said. It was supposed to be a simple briefing on human combat methods. Instead, it became a complete re-education in how to think about conflict. The seminar had started with basic questions. What are you fighting for? What are you willing to sacrifice to achieve it? What will you do if conventional methods fail? But as the discussion progressed, the questions became more disturbing. How far will you go to protect your species? What methods are truly unacceptable if extinction is the alternative? How do you prepare your soldiers to fight enemies who don't follow any rules? By the end of the seminar, I found myself thinking like a human, Zexithera whispered. Seeing every conflict as a potential species threat, analyzing every tactical situation in terms of survival, rather than victory, planning for scenarios where normal morality becomes a luxury I can't afford. The effect was spreading across the galaxy. Military officers who studied human methods began implementing them in their own forces. Training programs changed to include psychological conditioning. Tactical doctrines were rewritten to account for unconventional warfare. Even civilian populations began to think differently about defense and security. The humans didn't conquer the galaxy, Zexithera said. They did something worse. They taught the galaxy to think like them. They infected every military in known space with their survival philosophy, their willingness to sacrifice everything, their ability to see war as a natural state rather than an aberration. The council members looked around at each other, and Zexithera could see the realization dawning in their eyes. They were beginning to understand that this wasn't just a military briefing. This was a warning about what their civilization was becoming. The next major conflict will be different, she continued. When it comes, and it will come, it won't be fought according to traditional rules. Every species in the galaxy now knows human methods. Every military has studied their tactics. Every government has contingency plans based on total war scenarios. What do you think will happen? Asked Varthan. Zexithera stood up and walked to the window again. Outside, the peaceful streets of Zenthar Prime looked the same as always. But she knew that appearance was deceptive. In military academies across the galaxy, young officers were learning to think like humans. In government buildings, politicians were planning for scenarios that previous generations would have considered unthinkable. In training facilities, soldiers were being conditioned to see survival as the only acceptable outcome. I think the galaxy has learned something it can't unlearn, she said finally. Before humans arrived, war was a political tool. something civilized beings used to resolve disputes when other methods failed. Now war has become something else, a test of species survival, a competition to see who wants to continue existing more than the other side wants to destroy them. She turned back to face the council. The humans saved us from the hegemony, but in doing so, they taught us to become something we never were before. They made us dangerous in ways we never wanted to be dangerous. And now every conflict will be fought by beings who think like humans think, who see every enemy as a potential extinction threat, who are willing to sacrifice everything rather than risk defeat, who have learned that the only acceptable outcome of war is the complete inability of your enemies to threaten you again. The silence in the chamber stretched on for long minutes. Finally, Council Leader Varthan spoke. What do you recommend we do with this information?